Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, you'll find various videos produced in an effort to defend historic Christianity from alternative viewpoints that skeptics and others bring. I hope you'll find value in my work in the video that you're about to watch. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I look forward to receiving your feedback. Currently, I'm going through Paul Copan's work, Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. Very important work in dealing with new atheist objections to biblical Christianity. These are the contents of that book. Paul Copan is Ledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida. He is the author and editor of over 20 apologetics and philosophy books, lives with his wife and 5 children in the great state of Florida. This is a continuation of part 2 of Is God a Moral Monster? And the overarching title of part 2 is God, Gracious Master or Moral Monster. Today we're doing chapter 3, where we ask, does God have a great appetite for praise and sacrifices? Is he divinely arrogant or is he humble? Humility is a misunderstood virtue. The country singer, Mac Davis, boldly sang that it was hard to be humble since he was perfect in every way. Paul Copan grew up hearing lines such as, humble and proud of it, or, have you read my book, Humility, and How I Attained It? Obviously dripping with sarcasm. We immediately detect something wrong with this picture, yet the new atheists wonder how God, who is so, God-centered, can't also be accused of narcissism and vanity. According to Richard Dawkins, God is obsessed with his own superiority over rival gods, end quote. The God of the Bible seems to seek attention and to crave praise, an altogether unflattering characteristic. God is out to make a name for himself, according to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 23. God delivers his people from Egypt for the sake of his own name, according to Psalm chapter 106 and verse 8. So, does God have an unhealthy self-preoccupation, Paul Copan asks? Do our atheist friends have a point that God has this unhealthy self-preoccupation? They don't have a point on this one. The new atheists don't have a point on this one. On closer inspection, God turns out to be a humble, self-giving, other-centered being, rather than a self-centered being. But to explain what we mean, we need to start by defining our terms. On one occasion, Winston Churchill described a particular person this way. He's a humble man and for good reason, end quote, from Winston Churchill. Apparently, that man had his limitations and needed to keep his limitations in mind. Before approaching most topics, it's good to clear the decks and first define our terms. So what do we really mean by pride and humility? Pride, we know, is an inflated view of ourselves, a false advertising campaign promoting ourselves because we suspect that others won't accept who we really are. Pride is actually a lie about our own identity or achievements. To be proud, Copan says, is to live in a world propped up with falsehoods about ourselves, taking credit where credit is not due. In a sense, we can take pride or be gratified in our work. Paul did so as an apostle in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 17. Paul was proud of the early Christians' progress in their faith and in their proper use of their God-given abilities, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 14, and 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 3 and 4. In such cases, Paul recognized that God is the great enabler. The God-dependent believer can boast in the Lord and in the cross of Christ. This is no pull yourself up by your own bootstraps type of self-reliance. That would be a failure or refusal to acknowledge our proper place before God in light of his grace. What then is humility? Humility involves having a realistic assessment of ourselves, our weaknesses, and our strengths. Plagiarism, a big problem in the academic world these days, is an attempt to take credit for someone else's work. Plagiarizers create an impression that's out of touch with reality. But think about this. For Yo-Yo Ma to claim that he really can't play the cello all that well, or for Landon Donovan to say he really can't play soccer, would be equally out of touch with reality. That would be a false humility. What's more, these kinds of statements are usually a backdoor attempt to get attention. True humility doesn't deny abilities, but rather acknowledges God as the source of these gifts for which we cannot take credit. What do we have that we didn't receive? Paul asked that question to the Corinthians. To be humble is to know our proper place before God, with all of our strengths and weaknesses. Well then, is God proud? No. God has a realistic view of himself, not a false view of himself or an exaggerated view of himself. God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being, which makes him worthy of worship. In fact, our word worship is a kind of contraction of the Old English word worthiosipe, or worthship. So, if an all-powerful but despicably evil being demanded our worship, like the new atheists characterize God as, or caricature God as, that's a better word. The new atheists caricature God as a despicably evil being that demands our worship. The new atheists say that about him. We shouldn't give this type of being our worship. This type of being would not be worthy of worship. They would actually be right. The type of being that they describe would not be worthy of worship. However, they strawman this God, and that's why they're wrong. God does not take more credit than he deserves. For example, God does not claim to make choices that are God does not claim to make choices that morally responsible humans must make, nor does he take credit for being the author of evil in the name of sovereignty, which some Christians tend to assign to him when they praise God for evil things. No, God doesn't think more highly of himself than he ought to think. Rather, God thinks quite accurately about himself. Is God's image divine pride or a gracious gift? Daniel Dennett's charge. Daniel Dennett is an atheist that we've mentioned earlier in this series. Daniel Dennett's charge that God is just a superman who has an appetite for praise seems to be justified by the idea that God makes humans in his image, according to the end of Genesis chapter 1. God is like a vain toy maker, creating dolls that look just like him. Isn't God's act of creating humans in his image just another sign of vanity? Actually, to be made in God's image and to receive salvation, or entrance into God's family, which is what salvation is, entering into God's family. To be created in his image and to be able to enter into his family are expressions of God's kindness, not divine arrogance. They're actually God humbling himself and condescending to our level so that we can approach him, because without his humility, without his condescension, without him sending Christ at the fullness of time, we would not be able to enter into his presence or to receive that salvation that he so graciously offers through the cross of Christ. When God created human beings, he uniquely equipped them for two roles, as the early chapters of Genesis 6 suggest. The first role for humans is our kingly role. In this role, God endowed us to share in ruling the creation with him. The second role that God endowed us with is the priestly role. And this is the role of relating to or walking with God and orienting our lives around him. Being made in God's image as priest kings brings with it the ability to relate to God, to think rationally, to make moral decisions, to express creativity, and with God to care for and wisely harness creation. That would be dominion. This is privilege, not bondage. The new atheists who don't have this type of relationship with God think that this type of arrangement with God is asking him to become bond slaves, as though slavery, the type of slavery that they're thinking about is the unpleasant kind, that is not the kind that is uh, the biblical slavery that's described in the Old Testament. The chance to have a relationship with God is a privilege. It is not bondage. And in the Old Testament, as we'll see as we go through this book, masters were to be kind and just and care for their servants. And if that didn't happen, that is a blight on the wicked master, not on the God who allowed the working arrangement as it's described in the Bible. Our being made in God's image is simply God spreading the wealth. God's rich goodness overflows to his creation, which lives, moves, and has its being in him. Though God created freely and without constraint, God is bursting with joy and love to share his goodness with his creatures. He allows us, his image bearers, to share in a very limited way in his characteristics. God enables us to participate in the life of divine community, the Trinity, a life that fills him with great joy and pleasure, according to 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. God bestows on us the great compliment of endowing us with a privileged position and with important capacities, ones that reflect God's own wonderful nature. What is the biology of religious devotion? The inventor, Thomas Edison, said that humans are incurably religious. History certainly bears this out. But why have humans been so religiously inclined across millennia and civilizations? Neo-atheists Dawkins and Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, interpret the phenomenon this way. They say theology is biology. To Dawkins, God is a delusion. For Dennett, religious believers are under a kind of spell that needs to be broken. Like computers, Richard Dawkins says, we come equipped with a remarkable predisposition to do and believe what we're told. So young minds full of mush are susceptible to mental infections or viruses or memes. Charismatic preachers and other adults spew out their superstitious bilge, and later generations latch onto it and eventually create churches and religious schools. Even if there isn't a God gene, humans have a certain religious urge and apparent hardwiring in the brain that draws us to supernatural myths, so says Dawkins, and so would say Dennett. Some conclude, therefore, that God doesn't exist, but is simply the product of predictable biological processes. One big problem with this statement, however, it's a whopping non sequitur. It just doesn't follow that if humans are somehow wired to be religious, God therefore doesn't exist. This is what's called the genetic fallacy, proving or disproving the truth of a view based on its origin. In this case, God's existence is a separate question from the source of religious beliefs. We need to sort out the biology of belief from the rationality of belief. There's more to say here. We could turn the argument on its head. If God exists and has designed us to connect with him, then we're actually functioning properly when we're being directed toward belief in God. We can agree that natural and physical processes partly contribute to commitment to God. In that case, the basic argument of Dawkins and Dennett could actually support the idea that religious believers are functioning decently and in order. On top of this, we're also left wondering why people would think up gods and spirits in the first place. Why would humans voluntarily sacrifice their lives for some intangible realm? Maybe it's because the physical domain doesn't contain the source of coherence, order, morality, meaning, and guidance for life. Humans, though embodied, are moral, spiritual beings. They're able to rise above the physical and biological to reflect on and end on their condition. This can result in the search of a world transcending God. Attempts by these new atheists to explain away theology as a useful fiction, or worse, a harmful delusion, fall short of telling us why the religious impulse is so deeply embedded. If God exists, however, we have an excellent reason as to why religious fervor should exist. Now we're going to see how worship is getting in touch with reality. During his Christian phase, singer Bob Dylan came out with the song, "Gotta Serve Somebody." It may be the devil, or it may be the Lord, he sang, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Jesus tells us that worship is directed to either God or a God substitute of our own making. That is an idol. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus asserts that we can't serve two masters at the same time. Jesus says that we cannot love both God and wealth. In Romans chapter 6, Paul affirms that we'll either be slaves to obedience or slaves to disobedience. As we've seen, we are naturally religious creatures. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 acknowledges that God has placed eternity in our hearts. We are designed by our Creator to worship and serve, and we will without fail worship and serve something. Sadly, most of us worship and serve that which is created rather than the Creator, according to Romans 1. Romans 1 bears that out. Now, if God truly exists, then worship turns out to be moral, spiritual creatures getting in touch with reality. Just as genuine humility is rooted in reality, so is worship rooted in reality. Why does God insist that we worship Him? For the same reason that parents tell their young children to stay away from fire or speeding cars. God doesn't want humans to detach themselves from ultimate reality, which only ends up harming us. God's calling for our worship isn't a manifestation of His pride or false, overinflated view of Himself. The call to worship means inclusion in the life of God. It's actually a very loving and humble and condescending thing, condescending in the positive sense of the term, a thing for Him to make available to us. The call to worship means that we can be included in the life of God. That is a loving and humble and sacrificial thing for Him to offer to us. Worship expresses an awareness of God's and thus our proper place in the order of things, and it also transforms us into what we were designed to be. In the end, God desires to be known as God, which is only appropriate and the ultimate good for creatures. On the other hand, for humans to desire universal eternal fame would be reality-denying idolatry. We get rather disgusted when a person is constantly fishing for compliments, don't we? Why then does God do this? Why then does God fish for compliments? Why all the praise seeking? Why does God seek our praise? Actually, in the Bible, God isn't the one commanding us to praise Him. Typically, fellow creatures are spontaneously calling on one another to do so, to recognize God's greatness and worthship. Praise naturally flows from and completes the creature's enjoyment of God. God is self-sufficient and content in and of Himself. He doesn't need frail humans for some sort of ego boost. Boy, you hear the new atheists in their railing against the Christian God. They seem to make reference to that God is just a God who has this insatiable ego and commands us to worship Him so He can satisfy Himself. Well, here, Paul Copan is directly refuting that. They have such the wrong impression, the wrong understanding of who this God is. Of course they're going to be upset about what they think is the God of the Bible. They're attacking a straw man over and over and over again, and it is so sad, because they're going to miss out on eternity as a result. So praise naturally flows from and completes the creature's enjoyment of God. God is self-sufficient and content in and of Himself. God doesn't need frail humans for some sort of ego boost. Psalm chapter 50 verse 12 reminds us, if God were hungry, He would not tell us, for the world is His and all it contains. C.S. Lewis had his own misconceptions about this notion of praise and wrote of the lesson that he learned. C.S. Lewis, quote, begins, quote, "But the most obvious fact about praise, whether of God or anything, strangely escaped me. I thought of it in terms of compliment, approval, or the giving of honor. I had never noticed that all enjoyment spontaneously overflows into praise. The world rings with praise. Lovers praising their mistresses, readers their favorite poet, walkers praising the countryside, players praising their game. I think we delight to praise what we enjoy what we enjoy because Praise not merely expresses, but completes the enjoyment. It is appointed consummation. Lewis realized, end quote, Lewis realized that praise stems from doing what one can't help doing, giving utterance to what we regard as supremely valuable. It is good to sing praises to our God. Why is it good to sing praises to our God? For it's pleasant and praise is becoming. That's Psalm chapter 147, verse 1. Another related point. When we creatures truly show love for God, it's not because of a crass desire for rewards or to avoid punishment. The sheer enjoyment of God's presence, the greatest good of humans, and his approval of us are reward enough. Once again, Lewis has offered a delightful picture. C.S. Lewis again, quote, money is not the natural reward of love. That is why we call a man mercenary if he marries a woman for the sake of her money. But marriage is the proper reward for a real lover, and he is not mercenary for desiring it. Those who have attained everlasting life in the vision of God know very well that it is no mere bribe, but the very consummation of their earthly discipleship, end quote. The humble self-giving God. Many Christians have a false impression that something resembling divine humility appears occasionally in the Bible. For example, in the incarnation of Christ. But that humility isn't an enduring divine quality. Upon closer inspection, God, yes, even in the Old Testament, is characteristically humble. The high and exalted one dwells with the contrite and lowly of spirit, according to Isaiah 57:15. Psalm chapter 113, verses 5 and 6 affirms a God who stoops to look upon us. In God's interaction with Israel, we see an other-centered, patient endurance despite Israel's rebellion, grumbling, and idolatry. Copan says the New Testament only expands on this theme of divine humility. It doesn't invent it. There's, in the New Testament, God's humility is made, God's humility is made more apparent in three ways. First, God is triune. Three distinct divine persons share an eternal, unbreakable unity of one being. As an analogy, think of a mythological three-headed dog, Cerberus. Three centers of awareness having a canine nature, but in one dog. God is inherently loving and self-giving within the relationships of the divine family, the Trinity. In this divine inter and interconnection of mutuality, openness, and reciprocity, there is no individualistic competition among the family members, but only joy, self-giving love, and transparency. Rather than being some isolated self or solitary ego, God is supremely relational in his self-giving, other-oriented nature. So after God is triune, second, God becomes human. Further evidence of divine humility is the incarnation of Christ. God becomes a Jew in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. As humans are made in God's image, it's not a contradiction for God to become human. After all, what makes us human is derived from God's nature in the first place. So, the incarnate Christ describes himself as gentle and humble in heart. This in the very same context as his declaration of uniquely knowing, relating to, and revealing the Father, and being the one who gives the weary rest for their souls. Triune becomes human. Greatness and humility don't contradict each other. In fact, God's greatness is seen in his willingness to serve us. I am among you as the one who serves. Luke chapter 22. Jesus comes not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Let me say that again, just to be clear. Jesus comes not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Third, God, in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ, takes our place on a cross. A Muslim friend of Copan's, Abdul, once expressed his difficulties with God becoming a human and dying on the cross. It's such a humiliation, Abdul exclaimed. For the Muslim, God is so utterly transcendent and removed from us. Yet, the second chapter of Philippians marvelously displays the depths to which God is willing to go for our salvation. God the Son humbles or empties himself, the kenosis, becoming a slave, the doulos, who dies fully naked for all to see in great shame and humiliation. Jesus' crucifixion is a picture of both humiliation and greatness. God's humiliation turns out to be his own mark of distinction and moment of glory. Jesus, who was faithfully living out Israel's story as God had intended it, was actually enduring the curse of exile and alienation so that God's new community could receive blessing. John's gospel refers to Jesus being lifted up on the cross. This is both literal and figurative. Being lifted up is both the physical act of being raised up onto a cross and the figurative reference to exaltation and honor from God, including the drawing of nations to salvation. The moment of Christ's humiliating death is precisely when he is glorified. God's great moment of glory is in the experience of the greatest humiliation and shame, when he takes the form of a slave and suffers death on a cross for our sakes. This is how low God is willing to go for our salvation. This act of divine service to humans is utterly unique in antiquity. No wonder the later German New Testament scholar Martin Hengel wrote, quote, "The discrepancy between the shameful death of a Jewish state criminal and the confession that depicts this executed man as the pre-existent divine figure who becomes man, who humbles himself to a slave's death is, as far as I can see," Hengel says, "without analogy in the ancient world," end quote. Once a Muslim expressed to Copan his disbelief and even scorn at the idea of Christians wearing crosses. The Muslim said, "How can Christians wear with pride the instrument of torture and humiliation? If your brother were killed in an electric chair, would you wear an electric chair around your neck?" Copan replied that it depends. Copan said, "If my brother happened to be Jesus of Nazareth, and his death in an electric chair brought about my salvation and was the means by which evil was defeated and creation renewed, then he would have transformed a symbol of shame and punishment into something glorious," Copan said. One theologian put it this way: "It's truly godlike to be humble, as it is to be exalted." The new atheists wrongly assume that God must be an egalitarian deity, that he is just like us. See Psalm chapter 50, verse 21. We can set aside the false accusation that God is a divine, pompous windbag seeking to have his ego stroked by human flattery. That's the argument of village atheists, not those who've seriously examined the scriptures. That's the end of chapter 3. Next time we'll continue part 2. And we will look at chapter 4, where we see, does God have monumental rage and king-like jealousy? We will come to a better understanding of the covenant-making God. So, thank you for tuning in this time to Blessed Man Meditations, to this portion of Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, where we get a better understanding of the Old Testament God that is so deeply misunderstood and is strawmanned so terribly by the new atheists. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please continue to pray for this ministry and consider supporting my ministry by purchasing my published work, the 30-chapter volume on the Book of Psalms, Pinnacles and Plateaus, Meditations with the Psalmist. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.